start with what might seem like a few odd questions. First, how many of you have visited a prison at some point in your life? Show by raise of hands. Try to see you guys. Okay. Not a jail or prison. Okay. And then the next question I want to ask is, how many of you plan to visit a prison at some point in the future? By raise of hands. Okay. And then my last question is, how many of you think that you really know what goes on in prisons on a day-to-day basis? By raise of hands, please. Okay. Although most of us have never been to a prison, most of us never plan to go to a prison, and most of us really don't know much about what goes on in prisons, each year the United States spends about $30 billion a year on a tremendously failing system. Today, I'm going to address why recognizing prisoner free speech rights, the right to communicate with the external public, is necessary in order to correct our prison problem. And we do have a prison problem. As most of you may know, the United States is home to about 25% of the entire world's incarcerated population, although it only makes up about 5% of the total world's population. We also rank first in the area of reoffenders, so we know our prison system is ineffective. And unfortunately, we also rank first in the rate we incarcerate our youth. Now, I've personally seen the devastating effects of mass incarceration. I've counted at least 14 cousins, friends, family members, uncles, that have all followed the pipeline to prison. Probably what explains why I stand before you a freedom fighter today. When I first became a freedom fighter, I thought, why aren't we talking about this more? Why aren't we taking serious steps to correct this enormous problem in our democracy? And through my research, I found that we don't talk much about our prison problem because there's a big part of the narrative missing from that conversation. It's because prisoners really don't have very many free speech rights. They don't have very much of a voice. For example, while you and I have free access to speech rights, we can read whatever we want, U.S. prisoners are limited by whatever the prison chooses that they can review or be approved to be sent. Just last month, the New York Times revealed an article that discussed 10,000 book titles that are banned from Texas prisons. Book titles like stuff we read in high school, a lot of us, like Memoirs of a Geisha or The Color Purple. There was some more serious stuff on there. There were some more threatening titles that were eliminated as well, like A Charlie Brown Christmas. It was a pop-up version, so, that might have something to do with it. The Texas ban also eliminates what I assume has to be the scariest Sears and Roebuck catalog that ever existed. Maybe because it's from 1908, I don't know. Prisoners also have very limited communication with the public. Prisoners can't communicate willingly like the rest of us, no matter what goes on in prisons. And initially, that might not sound too bad. They are in prison, they are prisoners, they have done something wrong. But consider that there are very few ways that they can reach out if something goes wrong. Let's suppose a prisoner does have a grievance. Let's talk about what that might look like. If a prisoner has a grievance, typically what he or she, typically what they must do is file a grievance with the prison itself, using procedures that are also set by the prison. And if you think about it, it's kind of weird, because if you had a problem with the supervisor at your job, the last thing you probably would want to do is tell that supervisor. But that's exactly what prisoners have to do if anything goes wrong. And let's say they power through and they file that grievance anyway, then they of course risk being treated more unfairly, being punished by prison officials. In 1987, my grandmother's husband was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to life in prison. I wasn't very close to him, so I'm not saying that to evoke any sympathy. But many years later, I found out after completing law school that he was punished and spent 3 months in solitary confinement for trying to complain about a grievance and reach out to someone on the outside about it. And of course, he had no legal representation when that letter failed to go out because prison authorities wouldn't allow it. He instead had to just suffer those consequences. He didn't have money for an attorney. You can't earn money in prison. My grandmother was poor, and so she definitely could not help him. And the grievance procedure didn't work out, obviously. Lots of us assume that right to an attorney, that right to a free attorney, goes on. After you're convicted and incarcerated, you no longer have a right to an attorney. That doesn't happen. So, what is a person to do? Well, most of us have this concept in our head that prisons are filled with these glorious law libraries where prisoners can sit down and figure out the next moves in their case. Well, the prison library in most prisons just doesn't exist. And that jailhouse lawyer that's in all the popular movies, he doesn't exist usually either. So what's left? Well, what's left is generally people who are incarcerated, they have to communicate with someone on the outside. They have to get their message to someone on the outside with hopes that they can help them. And they have to do that by using means that are approved by the prison. Typically, that means that we're talking about a phone call, in-person visit, or by mail. And all three of those mediums, I guarantee you at any prison, are heavily regulated by the prison officials. So, in attempts to communicate with the outside as their only option, they have to worry about the same problem we talked about before, which is reporting abuse to their abuser. I'm asking all of you today to be freedom fighters because prisoners have very few tools to fight for themselves. Also keep in mind that there's no uniform set of standards, there's no prison code of conduct by which prisons have to follow. And as you probably have guessed by now, there's no prisoner constitution, there's no prisoner bill of rights. And despite that lack of rights and despite those standards that don't exist, courts have decidedly taken a hands-off approach to our prison problem. The United States Supreme Court has said repeatedly in its prison cases, courts are ill-equipped to deal with the increasingly urgent problems of prison administration and reform. If they're not going to deal with it, who is? What has happened is this lack of standards and this situation that prisoners find themselves in with very few rights and this hands-off approach by courts, that's created this very secret system of managing prisons, this very secret system of deciding how people are treated, a system with no accountability. This no accountability system needs freedom fighters. We've allowed this to happen on our watch. Now, the concept of being a freedom fighter for a lot of you may sound a little daunting, strange, or just unrealistic, but it's certainly not a new concept. Many, many years ago, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall saw this coming. He warned us that if we cut off unfettered communication between prisoners and the public, that our prison system would worsen. That's exactly what has happened, and his words are still as true today as they were in 1974 when he first said, "In these days of strife in our correctional institution, the plight of prisoners is a matter of urgent public concern." Justice Marshall knew that the problem of our prisons belonged to us all, and he also knew that it would take public concern and for the public to stand up as freedom fighters in order to correct our prison problem. So today, I'm going to ask all of you to become freedom fighters. And again, that may sound a little daunting, but I'm sure that you can do it. And I'm not going to ask you to do anything too extreme. I'm not going to send you all to some prison. I'm not going to give you the day in the life. But what I am going to ask you to do is adjust your thinking. I'm going to ask you to adjust your thinking to think of prisoners as people first, and also think of them as prisoners, as people like one of your family members that have made a mistake. Sometimes many mistakes. Sometimes an awful mistake. I'm going to ask you all to transform your thinking to recognize that everyone deserves dignity. I'm asking you to transform your thinking to recognize